The antique brass key felt ice cold in my trembling palm as I watched strangers ransack my grandmother's house, grabbing everything they could carry while my own family stood by counting dollar bills. I had no idea that this tiny key, hidden in the lining of Grandma Rose's old jewelry box, would expose a family secret so devastating that it would turn my entire world upside down and reveal an inheritance worth more than anyone could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and 3 weeks ago, I thought I knew exactly who my family was. That was before my grandmother, Rose Hartwell, passed away at 87, leaving behind a sprawling Victorian mansion in Salem, Massachusetts, and relatives I'd never seen move so fast in my entire life. The funeral had barely ended when my Aunt Patricia, my father's older sister, announced that we needed to, quote, handle Rose's affairs quickly and efficiently, unquote. She'd driven up from Connecticut with her husband Roger and their twin sons Marcus and Daniel, both in their 30s and both sporting the kind of hungry expressions I'd only seen at Black Friday sales. "Sarah, honey," Patricia had said, her voice dripping with the fake sweetness she'd perfected over decades of real estate dealings. "I know this is hard for you, being so close to Mother and all, but we need to be practical. This house is far too big for one person to maintain, and frankly, the property taxes alone would bankrupt anyone who isn't prepared for the financial responsibility." I'd wanted to argue. Grandma Rose had raised me in that house after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. She'd been more than a grandmother. She'd been my mother, my father, my anchor in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly uncertain. The Victorian mansion on Elm Street wasn't just a house to me. It was home in every sense of the word. But at 28, working as a freelance graphic designer with an inconsistent income, I knew Patricia was right about one thing. I couldn't afford the upkeep on a 5-bedroom house with original hardwood floors, century-old plumbing, and a heating system that probably predated the Kennedy administration. "We've already contacted Morrison Estate Sales," Patricia continued, scrolling through her phone with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning this conversation for weeks. "They can have everything cataloged and sold within 10 days. The house itself should move quickly in this market. Salem's become quite trendy with all those young professionals working remotely from Boston." My cousin Daniel nodded enthusiastically, his accounting background evident in the way he'd already started categorizing grandmother's possessions into potential profit margins. "The furniture alone should bring in a decent sum. That dining room set is genuine mahogany from the 1920s, and I've seen similar pieces sell for thousands on estate sale websites." "What about personal items?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. "Grandmother's jewelry, family photographs, things that have sentimental value." "Of course, dear," Patricia waved dismissively. "Family members get first pick of personal items before the sale opens to the public, though I do think we should be reasonable about dividing things fairly among all the relatives." The way she emphasized fairly made my stomach clench. I'd lived in this house for 16 years, had memories attached to every room, every piece of furniture, every family heirloom that grandmother had carefully preserved. But Patricia had 3 sons and a legal husband, while I had no siblings and no legal claim beyond being Rose's granddaughter. My Uncle Robert, my father's younger brother, had flown in from Arizona with his wife Linda and their daughter Jessica. Robert had always been the quieter of my father's siblings, working as an engineer for an aerospace company and rarely visiting during grandmother's lifetime. But now, he stood in Rose's living room examining the crystal chandelier with the focused attention of someone calculating its resale value. "Mother always said this chandelier came from France," Linda observed, her camera phone clicking as she documented every angle. "Robert, didn't your mother mention it was an antique from the 1800s? Jessica, who was 25 and worked in marketing for a tech startup in Phoenix, was already researching comparable sales on her laptop. Vintage French crystal chandeliers in good condition are selling anywhere from $8,000 to $20,000, depending on provenance and documentation. I watched my family transform before my eyes into strangers who spoke in auction terms and profit margins. These were people who'd visited grandmother maybe twice a year, who'd sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, but had never been present for the daily reality of caring for an aging woman who'd lived through the Depression, World War II, and the loss of her husband and youngest son. "Sarah's been wonderful with Mother," Patricia acknowledged, her tone suggesting this was a minor footnote rather than 16 years of genuine love and care. "But we all have to remember that Rose's estate belongs to all her children and grandchildren equally. Mother never showed favoritism in life, and we shouldn't expect it in death." The legal reality was that grandmother had died intestate, without a will. Despite my gentle suggestions over the years that she should formalize her wishes, grandmother had always insisted that family takes care of family and that legal documents were unnecessary complications. Now, her trust in family loyalty was being tested by relatives who saw dollar signs where I saw memories. Morrison estate sales arrived the next morning with the efficiency of a military operation. Helen Morrison, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the emotional detachment of someone who'd spent decades liquidating other people's lives, walked through the house with a clipboard and camera, assigning values to everything from grandmother's wedding china to the stack of National Geographic magazines she'd saved since 1967.
"This is a beautiful property," Helen observed, her professional eye cataloging architectural details that would appeal to potential buyers. Victorian homes in Salem with original features are increasingly rare. The moldings, the stained glass windows, the hardwood floors. This house will sell quickly, probably above asking price. Patricia beamed as if she'd personally restored every decorative element. Mother was meticulous about maintenance. She had the roof replaced just 5 years ago, and the electrical system was updated in 2018. I wanted to mention that I'd been the one who'd coordinated those repairs, spending hours researching contractors and managing the work while grandmother recovered from her hip surgery. But pointing out my contributions felt petty in the face of such overwhelming family indifference to my relationship with Rose. "The contents are quite impressive as well," Helen continued, making notes about furniture, artwork, and collectibles. "Your mother had excellent taste. The mahogany dining set, the Persian rugs, the collection of first edition books. These items will attract serious collectors." Marcus, Patricia's older son, had been quiet during most of the family discussions, but now he spoke up with the authority of someone who'd clearly done his homework. "What about jewelry? Grandmother always wore beautiful pieces, and I remember her mentioning family heirlooms that had been passed down for generations." Helen consulted her notes. "We'll need to do a thorough search for valuable jewelry and important documents. Often, elderly homeowners keep precious items in unexpected places. Safety deposit boxes, hidden compartments, even sewn into clothing linings. We found everything from gold coins to stock certificates tucked away in the most unlikely locations." The mention of hidden valuables sparked immediate interest among my relatives. Daniel pulled out his phone and started researching techniques for finding concealed assets in estate sales. Roger began examining furniture for secret compartments. Even quiet Uncle Robert started looking at grandmother's belongings with new intensity. I felt sick watching them transform into treasure hunters, treating Rose's home like a game show where the prize was whatever they could claim before anyone else noticed its value. These people had barely known my grandmother as a person, but they were suddenly experts on her possessions and their worth. "We should establish some ground rules about the division of personal items," Patricia announced, her real estate training evident in the way she took control of the situation. "I propose that we each make a list of items we'd like to claim, and if there are conflicts, we'll resolve them through discussion or drawing lots." "What about Sarah? She lived here longer than any of us visited. Shouldn't she have first choice of personal mementos?" Patricia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, Sarah should have opportunities to claim meaningful items, but we need to be fair to everyone. Mother loved all her grandchildren equally. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Patricia's sons had visited grandmother maybe a dozen times in their entire lives. Jessica had been to the house twice that I could remember, but now they all had equal claim to Rose's lifetime of memories and possessions. I excused myself from the family meeting and walked upstairs to my grandmother's bedroom, the one place that still felt sacred despite the invasion of estate sale professionals and grasping relatives. Rose's presence lingered in this room. The lavender sachets she'd tucked into her dresser drawers, the romance novels stacked on her nightstand, the jewelry box that had belonged to her own mother. The jewelry box was a beautiful piece from the 1920s, made of dark wood with intricate inlay work and a tiny brass key that grandmother had always kept in the top drawer of her vanity. I'd watched her open it countless times during my teenage years, selecting earrings or a necklace for church or special occasions. Now, sitting on her bed and opening the familiar compartments, I was struck by how modest her jewelry collection actually was. A few pieces of costume jewelry, some pearl earrings that had been a wedding gift, a simple gold locket with my grandfather's photograph inside. Nothing that would interest the vultures downstairs calculating profit margins. But as I lifted the jewelry box to return it to the dresser, I heard something shifting inside, a faint rattling that didn't match the weight of the few pieces I'd just examined. The box felt heavier than it should, and when I shook it gently, there was definitely something loose inside that I hadn't seen. I examined the box more carefully, running my fingers along the edges and discovering what felt like a false bottom. The craftsmanship was so subtle that I'd never noticed it before, but there was definitely a hidden compartment beneath the main jewelry storage area. It took several minutes of careful manipulation before I found the tiny catch that released the false bottom. When it finally clicked open, I found myself staring at items that made my heart race with confusion and excitement. Tucked into the secret compartment was an antique brass key, unlike any I'd ever seen in the house. It was ornate, heavy, with intricate engravings that suggested it opened something important. Beneath the key was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and covered in my grandmother's careful handwriting. My hand shook as I unfolded the note, recognizing Rose's distinctive script, but confused by the formal tone of the message.
My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the family is circling like vultures, just as I always feared they would. The key you found opens something they don't know exists. Something I've kept hidden for 60 years because I knew this day would come. Look for the heart of the rose garden, where your grandfather proposed to me in 1954. Count 7 steps east from the largest rose bush. The truth about our family's real inheritance lies 3 feet below the surface. Trust no one else with this secret until you understand what you found. The family you think you know is not the family that deserves what I've protected all these years. With all my love and hopes for your future, Grandmother Rose. I read the note 3 times before the words fully sunk in. Grandmother had hidden something in the garden, something valuable enough to keep secret for 6 decades. Something she trusted only to me, despite having 5 other grandchildren and 3 living children. Downstairs, I could hear Helen Morrison explaining auction procedures to my relatives, their voices animated with the excitement of people who believed they were about to profit from someone else's lifetime of accumulation. They had no idea that the real treasure, whatever it was, lay buried in the backyard, waiting for me to uncover it with a brass key and the directions from a woman who'd known exactly how they'd behave when she was gone. I slipped the key and note into my pocket and returned the jewelry box to its original appearance. Whatever grandmother had hidden, whatever secret she'd protected for 60 years, I was going to find it before my family's greed destroyed everything she'd spent her life building. The estate sale was scheduled to begin in 3 days.
I had 72 hours to discover what Rose Hartwell had buried in her garden and why she'd trusted me, and only me, with the key to a family secret that was apparently worth more than everything the vultures were fighting over combined. That evening, I waited until the house fell silent before slipping out the back door into grandmother's garden. The October air carried the scent of dying roses and damp earth, and the old motion sensor light cast eerie shadows across the carefully maintained flower beds that Rose had tended for over 30 years. The rose garden occupied the southeast corner of the property, sheltered by a tall privacy fence that separated our yard from the neighbor's house. During my childhood, this had been grandmother's sanctuary, the place where she'd disappear for hours with her gardening gloves and pruning shears, emerging dirt-stained but peaceful in a way that housework never achieved. Now, armed with a flashlight and the cryptic instructions from her note, I felt like an intruder in a space that had always welcomed me. Look for the heart of the rose garden, where your grandfather proposed in 1954. I'd heard the story countless times, how William Hartwell had gotten down on one knee beside the largest rose bush on a spring evening, presenting my grandmother with a simple gold ring and promises of a lifetime together. The largest rose bush was easy to identify, even in the darkness. It was an ancient specimen that Rose had called her Queen Elizabeth, a climbing rose that had grown into a massive, thorny monument over the decades. The bush was easily 8 feet tall and twice as wide, its autumn, dormant canes creating a natural archway that had served as a backdrop for countless family photographs. I counted 7 steps east from the base of the Queen Elizabeth, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of mulch that grandmother had applied religiously every spring. 7 steps brought me to a section of the garden that looked perfectly ordinary. Well-tended soil, a few smaller rose bushes, and a decorative garden stone that I'd never paid much attention to before. But as I knelt and examined the area more closely, I realized the garden stone wasn't randomly placed. It was positioned exactly where my 7 steps had led me, a flat piece of slate about the size of a dinner plate, weathered but deliberately positioned to mark something significant. I moved the stone aside and began digging with the small garden towel I'd borrowed from grandmother's potting shed. The soil was softer than I expected, as if it had been disturbed more recently than the rest of the garden. 3 feet down felt like an enormous depth when digging by flashlight, but grandmother's instructions had been specific. 20 minutes of careful excavation revealed something that made my heart skip. The corner of what appeared to be a metal box, buried just enough to avoid detection by casual gardening, but shallow enough for someone with the right information to find. The box was larger than I had anticipated, roughly the size of a small suitcase, made of heavy steel and sealed with a substantial padlock that looked far newer than the 60 years grandmother had mentioned in her note. This wasn't some forgotten time capsule. This was something Rose had been actively maintaining and protecting. I tried the brass key from her jewelry box, and it slid into the padlock with the satisfying click of a mechanism that had been designed specifically for this purpose. The lock opened immediately, revealing that whatever was inside this buried treasure had been recently accessible to my grandmother. The contents of the metal box, illuminated by my flashlight beam, were unlike anything I could have imagined finding in Rose Hartwell's garden. Stacks of documents in protective plastic sleeves, photographs, what appeared to be stock certificates, and several smaller metal containers that suggested this was just the beginning of whatever my grandmother had hidden in her garden.
I carefully removed the first stack of documents, my hands trembling as I realized I was looking at legal papers that predated my birth by decades. Property deeds, stock transfers, bank statements, and correspondence with law firms in Boston and New York, all bearing the names Rose and William Hartwell. But it was the photographs that truly shocked me. Black and white images from the 1950s and 1960s,
showing my grandparents in settings I'd never heard them describe. Elegant parties, what appeared to be business meetings with men in expensive suits, and shots of them standing in front of buildings I didn't recognize, but that looked expensive and important. In one photograph, my grandfather William stood beside a man whose face I vaguely recognized from old newspapers, someone who looked like a political figure or business magnate from that era. Both men were wearing suits that clearly cost more than most people's monthly salaries, and they were standing in front of what appeared to be a construction site, with a sign that read, Hartwell and Associates Development. Hartwell and Associates Development. I'd never heard my grandparents mention owning or operating any kind of development company. According to family lore, William had worked as a bank manager, while Rose had been a homemaker who occasionally took in sewing to supplement their income. They'd been frugal, careful with money, the kind of people who saved every penny and never spent extravagantly on anything except maintaining their modest Victorian house. But these documents told a completely different story. Stock certificates from companies I'd never heard of, but that had clearly been valuable enough to lock away. Bank statements showing balances that would have made my grandparents wealthy by any measure. Property deeds for land and locations across Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. One particular document made me sit back in the dirt, stunned by its implications. It was a stock certificate for something called Hartwell Property Holdings Incorporated, dated 1963, showing William and Rose as majority shareholders in a company that apparently owned substantial real estate investments throughout New England. Beneath the stock certificates, I found correspondence with lawyers and accountants that painted a picture of sophisticated financial planning spanning decades, letters discussing tax shelters, investment strategies, and estate planning techniques that suggested my grandparents had been far more financially savvy than anyone in the family had ever suspected. But it was a letter dated just 18 months ago that truly made my hands shake. Written on the letterhead of Morrison, Bradley, and Associates, a law firm I'd never heard of, it was addressed to Rose Hartwell and concerned the ongoing management of family assets in preparation for estate transition. The letter referenced meetings Rose had attended, decisions she'd made about protecting certain investments from family members who lack the discretion and responsibility necessary for wealth management, and recommendations for ensuring that inherited assets transfer to the most suitable beneficiary. My grandmother hadn't just been hiding money, she'd been actively managing a fortune that none of us had known existed, while simultaneously planning to keep that fortune away from the very family members who were currently downstairs arguing over her dining room furniture. At the bottom of the box, I found a sealed envelope with my name written in Rose's handwriting for Sarah Mitchell, to be opened only after discovery of the garden cache. Inside was a letter that explained everything I'd just uncovered and so much more. My dearest Sarah, the letter began, if you are reading this, it means you have found the first of several caches I've hidden around the property. What you've discovered tonight represents only a fraction of the assets your grandfather and I accumulated during our marriage, assets that we deliberately kept secret from our children and their families. William and I learned early in our marriage that money changes people, often for the worse. When we began to achieve success with our property development business in the 1950s, we watched friends and relatives become demanding, entitled, and manipulative once they learned about our financial situation. We made the decision to live modestly and keep our wealth hidden, using it for charitable purposes and careful investments rather than conspicuous consumption. Your father, my beloved son James, was the only one of our children who possessed the character and integrity we hope to see in our family. He never asked us for money, never expected inheritance, and taught you the same values of hard work and self-reliance. When he and your mother died in that accident, I knew that you were the only person I could trust with the truth about our family's real financial situation. Your Aunt Patricia has always been motivated by money and status. She married Roger specifically because he was a successful lawyer, and she has raised her sons to believe they are entitled to wealth without earning it.
Your Uncle Robert is weak-willed and easily manipulated by Linda, who has spent their entire marriage resenting what she assumed was our modest lifestyle, while secretly believing we were hiding assets she deserved to share. The estate sale they're planning, the division of household goods they are orchestrating, none of that matters. The real inheritance, the assets that represent 60 years of careful investment and financial planning, will go to you alone. But first, you must prove that you can handle this responsibility without letting it corrupt your character or destroy your relationships. There are 4 more caches hidden on this property, each containing different aspects of our financial legacy. You have the keys and instructions to find them all, but you must do so before the estate sale begins and before your relatives discover what they are truly missing. More importantly, you must decide what kind of person you want to be when you possess the power that wealth provides.
The documents you've found tonight represent approximately $2.8 million in liquid assets and property holdings. The remaining caches contain information about investments, business interests, and trusts that increase that figure substantially. By the time you've found everything I've hidden, you will be responsible for managing assets worth more than $12 million. I am trusting you with this legacy not because of favoritism, but because you are the only person in our family who has demonstrated the character necessary to use wealth responsibly. You have never asked me for money, never expected handouts, never shown the entitled attitude that has poisoned your cousin's relationships with honest work. But wealth is a test, Sarah, and I have seen it destroy families far stronger than ours. You must decide whether to share this inheritance with relatives who have shown themselves to be greedy and manipulative, or whether to keep it secret and use it for purposes that would honor your grandfather's memory and values. The choice is yours, my dear granddaughter, but choose wisely, because once the secret is revealed, there will be no returning to the family relationships you've known. Money changes everything, and the people downstairs arguing over my furniture will become very different people once they realize what they've been excluded from. Find the remaining caches, understand the full scope of what I'm entrusting to you, then decide what kind of legacy you want to create with the power I'm placing in your hands. All my love and faith in your judgment, Grandmother Rose. P.S. The next cache is located in the old oak tree beside the carriage house. Look for the hollow 15 feet up on the north side. The brass key will open what you find there. I sat in the garden dirt, surrounded by the evidence of my grandmother's secret financial empire, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd just learned. $12 million. While my relatives fought over antique furniture and costume jewelry, I was sitting 3 feet away from assets worth more than any of them would earn in their entire lifetimes. But more shocking than the money itself was the revelation about my family's character. Rose's clinical assessment of Patricia's greed, Robert's weakness, and their children's entitlement. She'd spent years observing and evaluating her own family members, ultimately concluding that only I could be trusted with the power that wealth represented. The sound of a car door slamming in the driveway sent me into immediate panic. I quickly replaced the documents in their protective cases, sealed the metal box, and reburied it in its hiding place, smoothing the soil and replacing the garden stone exactly as I'd found it. By the time I slipped back into the house through the kitchen door, I could hear Patricia's voice in the front hallway, apparently returning from a late dinner with Roger and discussing strategy for the morning's estate sale preparations. "We need to be systematic about this," she was saying. "Helen Morrison knows her business, but we can't rely entirely on her assessments. Some of these antiques might be worth more than her initial estimates, and we need to make sure nothing valuable gets overlooked." I crept upstairs to my childhood bedroom, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd just learned. Tomorrow, the estate sale team would begin their final preparations. My relatives would continue their transparent grab for anything valuable they could identify, and I would have to pretend I knew nothing about the fortune buried literally beneath their feet while I figured out how to access the remaining 4 caches without being discovered. But first, I needed to understand exactly what $12 million meant, what responsibilities came with that kind of wealth, and whether my grandmother was right about my character being strong enough to handle the test she had designed for me. In 2 days, the estate sale would begin, and my greedy relatives would learn just how wrong they had been about Rose Hartwell's modest lifestyle. The question was whether I'd be ready for the family war that was about to begin when they realized what they had lost through their own greed and manipulation. The next morning brought chaos that I hadn't anticipated. Helen Morrison arrived at 7:30 with a team of 6 people armed with cameras, measuring tapes, and pricing equipment that looked sophisticated enough to appraise the crown jewels. Meanwhile, my relatives had apparently held an emergency family meeting the night before and decided to implement their own inventory control system. Patricia stood in the front hallway like a general commanding troops, clipboard in hand, directing her sons Marcus and Daniel to photograph every item before the estate sale team to begin their assessment. "I don't want anything disappearing before we've had a chance to evaluate it properly," she announced, shooting a meaningful glance in my direction that made it clear she considered me the most likely culprit. "Mother, this is ridiculous," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the secret knowledge burning in my chest. "Helen Morrison has been doing estate sales for 20 years. She's not going to steal grandmother's belongings." Roger emerged from the kitchen with a cup of coffee and the satisfied expression of someone who'd clearly orchestrated this morning's military operation. "Roger, we're just being thorough. There's nothing wrong with family members taking an active interest in protecting Rose's estate." What he really meant was that they didn't trust me alone in the house with items they considered valuable. The irony was almost laughable. They were photographing furniture and china while literally standing above assets worth more than everything they could see combined. Uncle Robert and his family had stationed themselves in the dining room, with Linda creating detailed lists of the silver service, crystal glasses, and china patterns that Patricia had already claimed for fair distribution among family members. Jessica sat at grandmother's desk with her laptop, researching comparable sales for everything from the antique mantel clock to the Victorian-era bedroom sets.
"Sarah," Linda called out, her voice carrying the artificial sweetness that meant she wanted something, "could you help us understand which pieces have been in the family longest? Your grandmother never really talked about the history of her antiques when we visited." The request was loaded with implication. Linda was fishing for information about provenance and age, factors that would significantly impact resale values. She was also subtly acknowledging that their family visits had been so superficial that they'd never bothered learning about Rose's possessions or their significance. I spent the morning playing along with their inventory theater while secretly planning my next move. The old oak tree beside the carriage house was visible from several windows in the main house, which meant I'd need to be extremely careful about timing my investigation. The tree was massive, probably planted when the house was built in the 1890s, with a trunk so wide that it would take 3 people holding hands to circle it completely. Finding a hollow 15 feet up on the north side would require either a ladder or serious climbing skills I wasn't sure I possessed. More importantly, I'd need to access it without attracting attention from the estate sale team or my suspicious relatives. My opportunity came during lunch when Helen Morrison suggested that family members take a break while her team conducted detailed measurements and photographs of the major furniture pieces. Patricia and Roger drove to town for sandwiches, taking Marcus and Daniel with them to scout other estate sales and get a sense of current market prices. Robert's family decided to explore Salem's tourist attractions, leaving me alone with Helen's team for the first time since they'd arrived. "Miss Mitchell," Helen said, consulting her clipboard with professional efficiency, "would it be possible for you to provide some family history about specific pieces? Provenance significantly impacts value, and you're the only person who seems to have actually lived with these items." I spent 30 minutes answering Helen's questions about furniture, artwork, and collectibles, sharing stories about pieces that had been in the house since my childhood.
but I was really waiting for the moment when her team moved to the second floor to photograph the bedroom furniture, giving me clear access to the backyard. The moment I heard footsteps on the stairs above, I slipped out through the kitchen door and headed for the oak tree. The carriage house had been converted into a garage decades ago, but the area around it maintained the original landscaping that included the massive oak tree and several smaller specimens that created natural privacy screens. 15 feet up seemed impossibly high from ground level, but the oak's thick branches provided a natural ladder for someone determined enough to risk the climb. I'd been an adventurous child who'd spent countless hours climbing trees in this same yard, but that was 20 years ago, and the stakes of falling had never included keeping $12 million secret from greedy relatives. The brass key hung around my neck on a chain I'd borrowed from my own jewelry box, and I'd tucked a small flashlight into my jacket pocket, along with leather gloves that would protect my hands during the climb. The north side of the tree faced away from the house, which meant I'd be invisible from most windows as long as Helen's team stayed focused on their indoor work. The first 10 feet of climbing were easier than I had expected. The oak's lower branches were thick and sturdy, positioned like the rungs of a ladder that had been designed by nature for exactly this purpose. But as I climbed higher, the branches became thinner and more flexible, requiring careful weight distribution and balance that made me grateful for every childhood hour I had spent in these same trees. At 15 feet, I found what Rose had described: a hollow in the tree's north side that was almost perfectly concealed by the natural bark patterns and shadow play of the oak's massive canopy. The opening was about the size of a shoebox, carved into the tree's heartwood in a way that suggested it had been created deliberately rather than formed by natural decay. Inside the hollow, my fingers encountered another metal container, smaller than the buried box, but sealed with the same type of heavy-duty lock that the brass key opened immediately. This container was designed to be weather-resistant, suggesting that Rose had planned for it to remain hidden in the tree for extended periods of time. The contents were different from the garden cachet, but equally shocking. Instead of financial documents, this container held correspondence that revealed another dimension of my grandmother's secret life. Letters from lawyers, business partners, and what appeared to be government officials, all addressing Rose Hartwell as someone with considerably more influence and authority than a simple homemaker. One letter, dated just 6 months ago, was from the Salem Historical Preservation Society, thanking Rose for her generous anonymous donation that had enabled the restoration of 3 historic properties in downtown Salem. The amount mentioned, $150,000, was more than most people earned in 3 years, casually donated by a woman who let her family believe she was financially limited. Another letter was from Boston Children's Hospital, acknowledging Rose's ongoing support of their cancer research program and mentioning that her cumulative contributions over the past 15 years had funded an entire research fellowship. Again, no specific amount was mentioned, but the tone suggested substantial sustained philanthropy that would have required significant wealth. But it was a folder labeled Property Management that truly expanded my understanding of Rose's hidden empire. Inside were reports from property management companies overseeing rental properties, commercial real estate investments, and development projects across New England. My grandmother hadn't just been wealthy, she'd been actively managing a real estate portfolio that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual income.
The reports detailed apartment buildings in Boston, commercial properties in Providence, and undeveloped land in Connecticut that was apparently being held for future development opportunities. Each property was managed through different companies, creating a complex web of investments that would be nearly impossible to track without access to Rose's private records. At the bottom of the container, I found another sealed envelope with my name, containing a letter that provided context for everything I'd discovered. My dear Sarah, if you have found this second cache, it means you are beginning to understand the scope of the responsibility I am placing on your shoulders. The documents in this container represent the charitable and philanthropic activities your grandfather and I have pursued for the past 30 years. We learned early in our marriage that wealth without purpose becomes a burden rather than a blessing. William and I decided that our success in business should be used to improve our community and support causes that mattered to us. We have donated millions of dollars to hospitals, schools, historical preservation, and research programs, always anonymously to avoid the complications that public philanthropy creates. Your relatives downstairs have no idea that the modest grandmother they are dismissing has funded cancer research, restored historic buildings, and provided scholarships for dozens of students who couldn't afford college educations. They see only an elderly woman with outdated furniture and conservative spending habits. This philanthropic work has been the most meaningful aspect of our wealth, Sarah. Money kept for its own sake becomes meaningless, but money used to create positive change in the world provides purpose and satisfaction that material possessions never can. The third cache is located in the basement, behind the old coal furnace that was replaced with modern heating in 1978. You'll find a loose stone in the foundation wall, approximately 4 feet from the floor on the east side. What you discover there will show you how we've planned for the future continuation of our charitable work. But I want you to consider something as you continue this treasure hunt. Your relatives are fighting over furniture and china worth perhaps $50,000 total, while completely missing assets worth hundreds of times that amount. This isn't coincidence. It's a reflection of their values and priorities. People who focus on immediate, visible wealth rarely develop the patience and wisdom necessary to build lasting prosperity. Your Aunt Patricia sees only what she can grab immediately. Your Uncle Robert looks for easy profits rather than long-term value creation. Their children have been raised to expect inheritance rather than working to deserve it. You are different, Sarah. You have lived in this house for 16 years without once asking me for money or expecting special treatment because of your circumstances. You have worked to support yourself, pursued education and career goals independently, and treated me with love and respect rather than manipulation designed to secure financial advantage. This is why the inheritance is yours alone. Not because I love you more than the others, but because you have demonstrated the character necessary to use wealth responsibly rather than letting it corrupt your relationships and values. Continue to the third cache. Learn about our plans for ensuring that this wealth continues to serve meaningful purposes long after we are gone. Then decide whether you are ready to accept the responsibility of carrying on the legacy William and I have spent our lives building. With love and growing confidence in your judgment, Grandmother Rose. P.S. Be careful about your timing with the basement search. The estate sale team will likely want to examine the mechanical systems and storage areas tomorrow. You'll need to find the third cache tonight after everyone has gone to bed. I carefully resealed the container and returned it to its hiding place in the oak tree, my mind reeling from the revelations about Rose's philanthropic activities. My grandmother hadn't just been hiding wealth, she'd been using it responsibly for decades, supporting causes and organizations that made genuine differences in people's lives. The climb down from the tree was more challenging than the ascent, requiring careful attention to foot placement and branch selection while my thoughts raced through the implications of what I'd learned. By the time I reached the ground, I could hear voices from the front of the house, indicating that my relatives had returned from their lunch break and market research expedition. I slipped back into the house through the kitchen door just as Patricia's voice carried from the living room, animated with the excitement of someone who'd discovered new opportunities for profit. Roger found 3 comparable estate sales in Springfield last weekend. Victorian furniture in similar condition sold for significantly higher prices than your initial estimates suggest. I think we need to reconsider some of your valuations. Helen's response was professionally diplomatic, but clearly strained. Mrs. Williams, I appreciate your research, but estate sale pricing involves many factors beyond simple comparisons. Local market conditions, buyer demographics, and seasonal variations all impact final sale prices. Marcus had apparently spent his lunch break researching online auction sites. Mother's right, he announced, scrolling through his phone with the intensity of someone who'd found a get-rich-quick scheme. I found similar pieces selling for 2 to 3 times Helen's estimates. We're potentially leaving thousands of dollars on the table with conservative pricing. I listened to their increasingly aggressive negotiations with Helen Morrison while thinking about the letters in the oak tree container. My relatives were fighting over every $100 of potential profit from furniture sales, completely oblivious to the fact that Rose had casually donated more money to charity in a single year than they would ever see from the entire estate sale.
Their greed was becoming more naked and desperate as they realized that dividing Rose's visible assets among 5 family groups wouldn't provide the financial windfall they'd all been counting on, which meant that their reactions would be even more extreme when they eventually learned about the millions they'd been excluded from inheriting. But first, I had to access the 3rd cache in the basement and understand what Rose had planned for the future of her philanthropic work. Tonight, while my greedy relatives slept upstairs, I would discover whether my grandmother's hidden legacy included instructions for continuing the charitable activities that had apparently given her life meaning and purpose. The basement search would be more dangerous than the garden or tree investigations. The house's old foundation and mechanical systems would provide plenty of hiding places, but they would also create noise and visibility risks that could expose my secret treasure hunt to family members who were already suspicious of my behavior. I had 8 hours until bedtime, and then one last chance to uncover Rose's plans before the estate sale began, and my access to the house became permanently compromised by strangers cataloging every possession for public auction. The afternoon brought an unexpected complication that nearly derailed my entire treasure hunt. Jessica, my tech-savvy cousin from Arizona, had apparently been doing more than just researching antique prices on her laptop. While I'd been climbing oak trees and processing the magnitude of Rose's philanthropic empire, she'd been conducting what she called digital archaeology on my grandmother's personal computer. "Uncle Robert, Aunt Patricia, you need to see this," Jessica announced from Rose's study, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd discovered something significant. "Grandmother's computer has some really interesting financial software installed, programs for managing investment portfolios and tracking real estate holdings." My blood went cold. I'd been so focused on the physical caches that I'd completely overlooked the possibility that Rose might have left digital traces of her hidden wealth on her personal computer. If Jessica had stumbled across financial records or bank statements, my secret treasure hunt could be exposed before I'd even accessed half of the hidden caches. I joined the family gathering around Rose's desk, trying to appear casually interested while internally panicking about what Jessica might have uncovered. Rose's computer was an older model, but she'd always been surprisingly tech-savvy for someone her age, using it for everything from online banking to digital photo storage. "Look at this," Jessica said, scrolling through what appeared to be a financial tracking program. "She's got software for monitoring stock portfolios, real estate investments, and something called charitable giving management. Why would someone living on a fixed income need sophisticated financial software?" Patricia leaned closer to the screen, her real estate background clearly helping her interpret what she was seeing. "Those look like property management reports. And these numbers, Robert, are those asset values? Because if they are, Mother was tracking investments worth significantly more than we realized. Roger had joined the crowd around the computer, his lawyer instincts obviously triggered by the discovery of unexpected financial records. Jessica, can you print out those screens? If Rose was managing assets that aren't reflected in the basic estate documentation, we need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. My mind raced through possible responses. I could claim ignorance about grandmother's computer usage, suggest that the software was outdated or unused, or try to redirect their attention back to the physical estate sale preparations. But any of those responses might increase their suspicion and prompt a more thorough investigation of Rose's financial situation. Grandmother was always very private about money, I said, hoping my voice sounded normal despite my racing heartbeat. She used that computer for online banking and managing her household finances. The investment software might be left over from when grandfather was alive. He handled all their financial planning until he passed away. Daniel had been quiet during most of the family discussions, suddenly spoke up with an observation that made my stomach lurch. Sarah, you lived here for 16 years. Did you ever see grandmother using investment software or managing business properties? Because these reports show activity from as recently as last month. The question was clearly a test. Daniel was an accountant who understood financial records, and he'd obviously noticed discrepancies between Rose's apparent lifestyle and the sophisticated asset management software on her computer. If I claimed complete ignorance about her financial activities, it would either make me seem oblivious or deliberately deceptive. Grandmother did spend time on her computer in the evenings, I admitted carefully. She said she was managing her retirement accounts and keeping track of her investments. I assumed it was just basic financial planning, monitoring her savings and ensuring she had enough income to maintain the house. Linda had been examining the printed financial reports with the focused attention of someone who sensed potential profit. These property management reports reference locations in Boston, Providence, and Hartford. If Rose owned rental properties in those markets, they could be worth substantial money, possibly enough to change the entire value of her estate. The family dynamic in the room shifted palpably as everyone realized they might be dealing with assets far beyond the household contents they'd been cataloging. Patricia immediately went into real estate mode, discussing market values and income potential. Roger started talking about estate tax implications and legal documentation requirements. Robert began questioning whether they'd need to hire additional professionals to manage properties they'd never known existed. I excused myself from the family meeting, claiming I needed to call my current freelance client about a project deadline. In reality, I needed time to think about how Jessica's computer discovery would impact my ability to access the remaining hidden caches without arousing even more suspicion.
The basement search I'd planned for tonight now felt exponentially more dangerous. If my relatives were beginning to suspect that Rose had hidden significant assets, they might become much more vigilant about my movements around the house. Any unusual nighttime activity could prompt questions I wasn't prepared to answer. But I also realized that Jessica's discovery might actually work in my favor. If the family became focused on investigating Rose's digital financial records, they might be less likely to notice my physical exploration of the property. Their attention would be directed toward computers and paperwork rather than gardens and basements. The afternoon dragged by with increasing tension as my relatives tried to decode the financial information Jessica had uncovered. Helen Morrison's estate sale team continued their methodical cataloging of household items, but I could sense that the family's priorities were shifting toward the possibility of discovering a hidden wealth rather than maximizing profits from furniture sales. By evening, Patricia had organized what she called a family financial review meeting scheduled for the next morning. She'd contacted her lawyer friend back in Connecticut and arranged for him to conference call with the group about estate management strategies for more complex asset situations than initially anticipated. "Sarah,"
Patricia said as the family gathered for dinner. "We're going to need your help understanding Rose's financial habits. You're the only one who observed her daily routines closely enough to provide insights about her money management practices." The request sounded reasonable, but I could hear the underlying demand for information. Patricia suspected that I knew more about Rose's financial situation than I'd been sharing, and she was clearly planning to interrogate me systematically until she extracted whatever knowledge I possessed. Roger nodded approvingly at his wife's strategic approach. "Tomorrow's meeting will help us understand whether we need to modify our estate sale timeline. If Rose owns significant assets beyond this house and its contents, we might want to delay the sale until we have a complete picture of her financial situation." The possibility of delaying the estate sale should have relieved me, but instead it increased my anxiety. If my relatives postponed their timeline while conducting a thorough investigation of Rose's assets, they might eventually stumble across evidence of the hidden cachets or the massive inheritance I was systematically uncovering. I needed to access the basement cache tonight, before tomorrow's family meeting created additional scrutiny of my behavior and movement around the house. But I also needed to be prepared for increasingly sophisticated questions about my knowledge of Rose's financial activities. After dinner, I helped clean the kitchen while listening to my relatives debate theories about grandmother's possible hidden wealth. Marcus suggested hiring a forensic accountant to analyze her computer records. Daniel recommended contacting banks directly to identify accounts that might not be reflected in basic estate documentation. Jessica offered to conduct more extensive computer analysis to recover deleted files or hidden financial information. By 10 o'clock, the house had finally settled into quiet, but I could hear Patricia and Roger talking in low voices in the guest bedroom, clearly planning strategy for tomorrow's interrogation session. Robert and Linda were in Rose's former bedroom, apparently going through her personal papers more systematically than they'd done during their initial sweep for valuable items. I waited until midnight before attempting the basement search, giving everyone time to fall asleep while I reviewed Rose's instructions about the third cache location. Behind the old coal furnace that was replaced with modern heating in 1978, a loose stone in the foundation wall, approximately 4 feet from the floor on the east side. The basement was more challenging to navigate silently than I had anticipated. The wooden stairs creaked despite my careful foot placement, and the concrete floor amplified every sound in ways that made me paranoid about alerting family members sleeping 2 floors above. The old coal furnace area was easy to locate, a section of the basement where the foundation walls showed evidence of modifications made when the heating system was modernized decades ago. The east wall was exactly where Rose had indicated, and at 4 feet from the floor, I found a foundation stone that moved slightly when I applied pressure. Behind the loose stone was a cavity that had been carefully carved into the foundation, large enough to hold another sealed container, similar to the ones I'd found in the garden and oak tree. This cache was the largest yet, suggesting that whatever Rose had hidden here represented a significant component of her secret legacy. The documents inside this container were different from both previous discoveries. Instead of financial records or philanthropic correspondence, I found what appeared to be legal documents establishing trusts, foundations, and ongoing institutional arrangements that would continue Rose's charitable work indefinitely. The first document was a trust agreement establishing the William and Rose Hartwell Foundation, a charitable organization designed to continue their philanthropic activities long after their deaths. According to the legal paperwork, the foundation had been funded with an initial endowment of $8 million and was structured to provide annual grants to hospitals, schools, and community organizations throughout New England. But what truly shocked me was discovering that the foundation had been operational for over 10 years, quietly distributing hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to worthy causes, while my family remained completely unaware of its existence. Rose hadn't just been planning for posthumous philanthropy, she'd been actively managing a major charitable foundation while letting everyone believe she was a modest retiree living on limited income. The trust documents named me as the sole successor trustee, responsible for continuing the foundation's work and making decisions about grant distributions. The legal language was complex, but the basic structure was clear. I would inherit not just Rose's personal wealth, but also the responsibility for managing a charitable organization that affected dozens of institutions and thousands of beneficiaries.
The second set of documents outlined the Foundation's current commitments and ongoing projects: scholarship programs at 3 universities, medical research funding at Boston Children's Hospital, historic preservation grants for Salem's downtown restoration, and emergency assistance programs for families facing financial crises. The scope was breathtaking. Rose had been quietly supporting her entire community while her own family fought over dining room furniture. But it was the third document that truly made my hands shake with the magnitude of what I was inheriting: a comprehensive asset inventory showing that the Foundation's current holdings had grown to over $15 million through careful investment and management. Combined with Rose's personal assets, I was looking at inheriting responsibility for more than $25 million in total wealth. $25 million! The number was so large that I had trouble processing its reality. My relatives were upstairs planning strategies to maximize profits from an estate sale they hoped might generate $50,000, while I was sitting in a basement looking at documentation of wealth that exceeded their wildest dreams by a factor of 500. At the bottom of the container, Rose had left her longest letter yet, explaining the full scope of what I was inheriting and the choices I would need to make. My dearest Sarah, if you have reached this third cache, you now understand that your inheritance involves far more than personal wealth. You are being entrusted with the continuation of charitable work that has been the most meaningful aspect of your grandfather's and my lives together. The Hartwell Foundation represents our belief that wealth should serve purposes beyond the comfort and security of those who possess it. For over 10 years, we have used our business success to improve education, healthcare, and community development throughout New England. The Foundation's work has touched thousands of lives in ways that most beneficiaries never realize. This is the legacy I am entrusting to you, Sarah. Not just money, but the responsibility to use that money wisely and generously. The Foundation's current commitments represent ongoing obligations to institutions and individuals who depend on our continued support. You cannot simply inherit this wealth and walk away from the responsibilities that come with it. But you also cannot continue this work if you allow family greed and manipulation to compromise your judgment or values. Tomorrow's family meeting will test your character in ways you cannot yet imagine. When your relatives learn about the Foundation's existence and the magnitude of the assets involved, they will demand inclusion, threaten legal action, and attempt to manipulate you into sharing control of wealth they have never earned or deserved. You will need to decide whether to stand firm in your role as sole successor trustee or whether to compromise the Foundation's mission by including family members who have demonstrated only greed and entitlement rather than genuine concern for charitable purposes. The fourth and final cache will provide you with the tools necessary to protect the Foundation's assets and your role as trustee from family interference. But first, you must survive tomorrow's interrogation and family pressure without revealing the magnitude of what you've learned about the true scope of Rose's legacy. Remember, Sarah, your relatives are fighting over crumbs while demanding control of the banquet. Don't let their noise and manipulation convince you to abandon the real work that needs to be done with the resources I'm entrusting to you. Find the fourth cache tomorrow night. By then, you'll need the protection and legal authority it contains to defend your inheritance from people who believe they deserve wealth they have never worked to create or preserve. With love and complete faith in your integrity, Grandmother Rose. P.S. The final cache is hidden in the most obvious place, somewhere they would never think to look because it's been visible all along. Think about what has always been present but never examined. Something everyone sees but no one truly notices. The answer is in plain sight, protected by the assumption that valuable things must be hidden rather than displayed. I resealed the container and returned it to its hiding place, my mind reeling from the revelation about the Foundation and the $25 million I was apparently inheriting.
But it was the even more overwhelming realization that Rose's final test was just beginning. Tomorrow's family meeting would determine whether I had the strength to protect her legacy from relatives who would stop at nothing to claim wealth they'd never earned or deserved. As I crept back upstairs to my childhood bedroom, I could hear Patricia's voice through the guest room door, apparently talking on the phone with someone about estate investigation strategies and asset recovery procedures. My aunt was clearly planning a full-scale assault on whatever financial secrets she suspected Rose had been hiding. I had 18 hours to figure out how to survive tomorrow's interrogation without revealing the magnitude of what I'd discovered, and then I needed to locate the fourth cache that would apparently give me the tools to protect my inheritance from family members who were about to become very dangerous indeed. The final test was about to begin, and the stakes were no longer just about money. They were about preserving a charitable legacy that had quietly improved thousands of lives while my family remained focused only on their own greed and entitlement. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray, drizzling weather that matched my growing dread about the family meeting Patricia had orchestrated. I'd barely slept, my mind cycling between the overwhelming responsibility of inheriting a $25 million charitable foundation and the immediate challenge of surviving my relative's interrogation without revealing what I'd discovered.
By 8 o'clock, the house had transformed into what felt like a corporate conference room. Patricia had rearranged the dining room furniture to create a formal meeting space, complete with legal pads, printed financial documents, and her lawyer friend participating via speakerphone from Connecticut. Roger sat at the head of the table with his briefcase open, looking every inch the attorney preparing for a deposition. "Sarah, please sit here," Patricia directed, indicating a chair that positioned me directly across from the rest of the family. The arrangement was clearly deliberate. They wanted to observe my facial expressions and body language while they questioned me about Rose's financial activities. The lawyer's voice crackled through the speakerphone with professional authority. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Jonathan Walsh from Hartford Legal Associates. Patricia has briefed me about the discrepancies you've discovered between Rose Hartwell's apparent lifestyle and the financial software found on her computer. I'm here to help you understand the legal implications of potentially undisclosed estate assets." Jonathan Walsh. Even his name sounded expensive and intimidating. I forced myself to maintain calm composure while internally panicking about how sophisticated this interrogation was about to become. "Let's start with the basics," Walsh continued. "Sarah, you lived with your grandmother for 16 years and presumably observed her daily financial habits more closely than anyone else. Did you ever notice any inconsistencies between her spending patterns and her claimed income sources?" The question was carefully phrased to trap me into either admitting knowledge I'd supposedly been hiding or revealing information that would contradict my previous claims of ignorance about Rose's true financial situation. "Grandmother was always very careful with money," I said, choosing my words carefully. "She budgeted for everything, tracked her expenses, and made sure she never spent more than she could afford. I assume this was because she'd lived through the Depression and learned to be cautious about financial security." Daniel leaned forward with the focused attention of someone who'd clearly prepared specific follow-up questions. "But did you ever wonder how she afforded the house maintenance, property taxes, and living expenses on what should have been a modest retirement income? This house requires significant upkeep, and the property taxes alone would strain most fixed incomes." I had wondered about exactly that, but admitting it now would suggest I'd been more observant about Rose's finances than I'd previously claimed ignorance about Rose's true financial situation. "Grandmother was always very careful with money. She budgeted for everything, tracked her expenses, and made sure she never spent more than she could afford. I assumed this was because she'd lived through the Depression and learned to be cautious about financial security." Patricia pulled out printed screens from Rose's computer, spreading them across the table like evidence in a criminal trial. "Sarah, these software reports show active management of real estate portfolios, investment accounts, and what appears to be substantial charitable giving. This isn't the financial activity of someone living on simple retirement savings." Roger nodded approvingly at his wife's prosecutorial approach. "The charitable giving records are particularly interesting.
They show regular donations of tens of thousands of dollars to various organizations. Sarah, did you ever see your grandmother writing large checks or discussing major charitable contributions? The irony was painful. My relatives were interrogating me about Rose's charitable giving while simultaneously planning to eliminate that philanthropy by claiming her wealth for themselves. They were treating her generosity as evidence of deception rather than recognizing it as the meaningful use of resources they wanted to redirect toward their own material benefit. Grandmother did support various charities. She donated to the hospital, the Historical Society, and some scholarship programs. But I thought those were modest contributions, maybe a few $100s here and there. She never talked about the specific amounts. Jessica had been quiet during the initial questioning, but now she spoke up with the confidence of someone who'd spent hours analyzing Rose's digital records. Sarah, I found evidence of wire transfers, property management communications, and investment account statements that suggest grandmother was managing assets worth millions of dollars. Are you telling us you never suspected anything? The direct accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Jessica was clearly skeptical of my claimed ignorance, and her tech background had given her access to financial information that was building a compelling case against my credibility. I don't know anything about wire transfers or investment accounts, which is technically true. I hadn't learned about those things from observing Rose's daily activities. If grandmother had significant wealth, she kept it completely separate from our household life together. Walsh's voice cut through the speakerphone with lawyer-like precision. Sarah, I need to ask you directly, do you have any knowledge of bank accounts, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, or other assets that haven't been disclosed as part of Rose's estate? Because if undisclosed assets exist, there could be serious legal and tax implications for everyone involved. The question was a trap, designed to force me into either perjury or confession. If I claimed complete ignorance and they later discovered the hidden cachets, I could be accused of estate fraud or tax evasion. But if I admitted knowledge of hidden assets, they would demand immediate disclosure of everything I'd found. I don't have any information about undisclosed assets, which is technically true. I didn't have information about assets that were legally mine, according to Rose's intentions, even if they weren't formally documented yet.
I never received any calls about rental properties, I said firmly. If there's a reference to someone with my name, it must be coincidental or a mistake in the records. Marcus had been scrolling through his phone during the questioning, apparently conducting real-time research to verify claims and cross-reference information. There's something else we need to discuss, he announced. I've been researching property records for this address, and it shows that this house was transferred to a trust arrangement 3 years ago. Sarah, are you listed as a beneficiary of any trusts associated with grandmother's estate? The question felt like a landmine. I didn't know the specific legal arrangements Rose had made for transferring property, but Marcus's research suggested there were formal trust structures I hadn't been told about. If I claimed ignorance and they later discovered I was a trust beneficiary, it would destroy any remaining credibility I had with the family. I don't know anything about trust arrangements, I said, which was true, regarding the specific legal structures Marcus was referencing, even though I now knew about the charitable foundation trusts. Patricia's expression shifted from suspicious to openly hostile. Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you. The evidence suggests that Mother was managing substantial hidden assets, possibly worth millions of dollars. As her granddaughter, who lived in this house for 16 years, you're either remarkably unobservant or you're deliberately concealing information that belongs to this entire family. The accusation was out in the open now. They believed I was lying about my knowledge of Rose's wealth, and they were prepared to escalate their investigation until they extracted whatever information they thought I was hiding. Roger leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully cornered a witness. Sarah, let me explain the legal reality here. If Rose died with undisclosed assets worth millions of dollars, and if those assets were hidden to avoid proper estate planning or tax obligations, everyone involved could face serious legal consequences. We're trying to protect you as much as ourselves by getting to the truth. The threat was barely veiled.
They were suggesting that my supposed knowledge of hidden assets could make me legally liable for estate fraud or tax evasion. Roger was using his lawyer authority to pressure me into confession through fear of prosecution. Walsh's voice through the speakerphone reinforced Roger's intimidation tactics. Sarah, I strongly recommend that you reconsider whether you have any knowledge that could help us locate undisclosed assets. The penalties for concealing estate assets can include criminal charges, as well as civil liability. It's much better to disclose everything voluntarily than to wait for the IRS or estate investigators to uncover hidden wealth. I sat in my grandmother's dining room, surrounded by family members who'd transformed into hostile interrogators, being threatened with criminal prosecution for protecting an inheritance that was legally and ethically mine, according to Rose's carefully planned intentions. The woman who'd raised me and loved me unconditionally had anticipated exactly this scenario and prepared me to face it. "I've told you everything I know," I said, meeting each family member's eyes directly. If grandmother hid hidden assets, she kept that information from me just as much as she kept it from all of you. I lived in this house, but that doesn't mean I had access to her private financial affairs. The room fell silent as my relatives processed my continued refusal to admit knowledge of Rose's hidden wealth. I could see Patricia and Roger exchanging glances that suggested they were planning their next strategy for extracting information they were convinced I possessed. Daniel broke the silence with a new approach that felt even more threatening than the direct accusations. "Fine, Sarah. If you don't know anything about hidden assets, then you won't mind if we hire professional estate investigators to conduct a thorough search of this property and all of grandmother's financial records. That kind of investigation can take weeks or months, during which the estate sale would be postponed and the house would remain under legal restriction." The proposal was clearly designed to pressure me into confession by threatening to eliminate my access to the property where the remaining cash was hidden. If professional investigators spent weeks systematically searching the house and grounds, they would inevitably discover evidence of Rose's hidden wealth and my recent treasure hunting activities. "We could also request court supervision of the estate process," Roger added, reinforcing Daniel's threat. "If there's any possibility of undisclosed assets or estate fraud, a probate judge might order the entire property to be placed under legal custody until a complete investigation can be conducted." I realized that my relatives were prepared to destroy my access to Rose's final cash and legal protections rather than accept my claims of ignorance about hidden assets. They sensed the proximity of substantial wealth, and they were willing to pursue it through legal warfare if necessary. "Do whatever you think is necessary," I said, hoping my voice conveyed confidence I didn't feel. "I have nothing to hide, and I want grandmother's estate to be handled properly according to the law." Patricia's smile was cold and predatory. "We're glad you feel that way, Sarah, because we've already scheduled appointments with estate investigators for this afternoon. If there are hidden assets on this property, we're going to find them, whether you cooperate or not." As the family meeting dissolved into individual conversations about investigation strategies and legal procedures, I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of making coffee. In reality, I needed to think about how to locate and access Rose's final cash before professional investigators arrived and eliminated any possibility of protecting the inheritance she had intended for me alone. "Hidden in plain sight," Rose's final clue had said. Something everyone sees, but no one truly notices. I had perhaps 6 hours before estate investigators arrived with equipment and expertise that would uncover any physical evidence of my treasure hunting activities.
The fourth cache contained the legal tools I needed to protect my inheritance from family warfare, but only if I could find it before my relatives' escalating investigation exposed everything Rose had spent 60 years planning and protecting. I poured coffee for my hostile relatives while my mind raced through every visible object in the house, looking for something that had always been present but never examined. Something that could contain the final piece of Rose's carefully orchestrated legacy transfer. The answer was somewhere in this house, hidden in the most obvious place by a woman who'd understood exactly how greed would blind her family to the truth they were desperately seeking.
I just had to figure out where she'd hidden the most important discovery before my time ran out and professional investigators destroyed everything she'd worked to protect. The estate investigators arrived at 2 o'clock sharp, driving a white van filled with equipment that looked sophisticated enough to locate buried treasure on a pirate island. Margaret Chen, the lead investigator, was a woman in her 40s with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent years uncovering hidden assets for suspicious families and government agencies. "Mrs. Williams," Margaret addressed Patricia with professional courtesy, "we understand you have concerns about potentially undisclosed assets in Rose Hartwell's estate. Our team specializes in comprehensive property searches, financial record analysis, and asset recovery for complex estate situations." Patricia practically beamed with satisfaction as she led Margaret through the house, pointing out areas where she suspected hidden valuables might be concealed. "We're particularly interested in unusual modifications to the structure, hidden compartments, or evidence of recent excavation around the property." My stomach clenched as Margaret's team unloaded metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar equipment, and thermal imaging cameras. If they conducted a thorough search of the property, they would inevitably discover evidence of my recent digging in the rose garden, and possibly detect the remaining buried cash if it was still hidden somewhere on the grounds. "Miss Mitchell," Margaret approached me with a clipboard and the kind of sympathetic but determined expression investigators probably practiced in training seminars. "As the family member who lived here most recently, we'd appreciate your cooperation in identifying any areas of the house or property that might warrant special attention." I forced myself to appear helpful, while internally panicking about how to protect Rose's final cash from professional detection. "I'm happy to help however I can. Grandmother was very organized, so if there are hidden items, they'd probably be in logical places that made sense to her." Margaret nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of insight we need. Often, elderly individuals hide valuables in locations that seem obvious to them, but aren't immediately apparent to family members. We'll start with a systematic sweep of the house interior, then move to outbuildings and grounds." Roger had positioned himself as the family's liaison with the investigation team, clearly enjoying his role as legal coordinator for what he obviously hoped would be a major asset discovery. "Margaret, we're particularly interested in this computer evidence suggesting sophisticated financial management. Is your team equipped to recover deleted files or hidden digital records?" "Absolutely," Margaret replied, signaling to a younger team member who was already setting up laptop computers and data recovery equipment. "Digital asset investigation is one of our specialties. We can recover financial records, communication history, and transaction data going back years." I watched the investigators begin their systematic search while my mind raced through every inch of the house, desperately trying to interpret Rose's cryptic clue about something hidden in plain sight. What had always been present, but never examined? What did everyone see, but no one truly notice? The living room was filled with furniture, artwork, and decorative objects that had been in the house for decades. The dining room contained Rose's formal china, crystal, and silver service that Jessica had already cataloged extensively. The kitchen held appliances, cookware, and household items that were functional rather than valuable. But it was when I looked into Rose's study that inspiration struck like lightning. The room contained hundreds of books, novels, biographies, reference volumes, and collections that Rose had accumulated over 60 years of marriage and widowhood. Books were the most visible objects in the house, present in every room, but individual volumes were rarely examined closely unless someone was specifically looking for something to read. Rose had been a voracious reader who'd often recommended novels to me, suggesting specific titles that she thought I'd enjoy or find meaningful. What if her final cache wasn't hidden behind or beneath something, but actually contained within something that was completely visible but disguised as an ordinary household object? I began examining the bookshelves in Rose's study while the investigators worked in other parts of the house. Hundreds of volumes lined the walls. Classics, mysteries, romances, and reference books that represented a lifetime of reading and collecting. Most appeared to be genuine books in normal condition, but as I looked more carefully, I noticed several volumes that seemed slightly different from the others. Near the center of the largest bookshelf, at approximately eye level where it would be easily accessible but not obviously special, was a leather-bound volume titled Estate Planning and Trust Management. The book looked official and boring enough that most people would ignore it completely, but something about its positioning and condition suggested it might be more than it appeared. I carefully removed the book from the shelf and immediately realized it was heavier than it should be for its apparent size. When I opened the cover, instead of printed pages, I found a hollowed-out interior containing another sealed container. Smaller than the previous caches, but clearly designed to hold documents of crucial importance.
The brass key opened this final lock as easily as the others, revealing what appeared to be Rose's most important legal documents and her final instructions for protecting the inheritance from family interference. The contents included official trust documents, power of attorney designations, and legal protections that would apparently allow me to defend my role as sole beneficiary and foundation trustee. But the first document I encountered was a notarized letter addressed to whom it may concern that explained the entire inheritance situation in legal terms that would be binding in court. I, Rose Margaret Hartwell, being of sound mind and legal capacity, hereby declare that the assets described in the accompanying trust documents represent my personal property, acquired through legitimate business activities conducted with my late husband William James Hartwell between 1954 and 2018. These assets, including real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and the charitable foundation established in our names, are being transferred exclusively to my granddaughter, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, in recognition of her character, integrity, and demonstrated capacity for responsible asset management. This transfer excludes all other family members not because of lack of affection, but because of their demonstrated patterns of financial irresponsibility, entitlement, and manipulation that make them unsuitable trustees for wealth intended to serve charitable and community purposes. Any legal challenges to this inheritance arrangement, any attempts to claim assets through estate procedures, or any efforts to contest the legitimacy of these transfers will result in the immediate dissolution of all charitable commitments and the redirection of all assets to national charitable organizations beyond the reach of my surviving family members. Sarah Mitchell has been chosen as sole inheritor because she has never asked for money, never expected special treatment, and never demonstrated the greed and entitlement that has characterized other family members' attitudes toward inheritance and wealth. This document serves as legal notice that the inheritance described herein is not subject to standard estate distribution procedures and cannot be claimed through intestate succession laws. All assets have been legally transferred through properly executed trust arrangements that supersede any family claims or expectations. The letter was notarized, witnessed, and accompanied by legal documentation that appeared to make my inheritance legally unassailable. Rose had spent years preparing for exactly the situation that was now unfolding, creating legal protections that would prevent my relatives from claiming assets through estate procedures or family litigation. But the final document in the cache that truly demonstrated the sophistication of Rose's planning, a comprehensive instruction manual explaining how to activate the legal protections, notify relevant financial institutions, and take control of the foundation and personal assets without interference from family members who might attempt to challenge the inheritance. The instructions included contact information for lawyers, accountants, and financial managers who'd been working with Rose for years and were prepared to implement the inheritance transfer immediately upon her death.
They'd been waiting for my contact to begin the process of formally transferring control of assets worth over $25 million. At the bottom of the container was Rose's final personal letter, written specifically for this moment when I'd completed the treasure hunt and was ready to claim my inheritance. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this letter, it means you have successfully found all 4 caches and understand the full scope of the legacy I am entrusting to you. More importantly, it means you have demonstrated the patience, determination, and character necessary to handle wealth responsibly. The documents in this final cache will protect your inheritance from family members who will undoubtedly attempt to claim assets they believe they deserve. The legal arrangements I have made are ironclad and cannot be overturned through estate litigation or family pressure. But legal protection is only part of what you will need to succeed as the guardian of this wealth. You must also develop the emotional strength to resist manipulation, the wisdom to use money for meaningful purposes, and the courage to maintain your values even when wealth provides the power to abandon them. Your relatives downstairs are about to discover that their estate sale and asset grabbing has been completely pointless. The household items they are fighting over represent less than 1% of the total inheritance you have already secured. Their greed and entitlement has cost them access to wealth that could have provided financial security for their entire lives. This outcome is not accidental or unfair. It is the natural consequence of values and choices they have made consistently over decades. People who focus on immediate material gain rarely develop the patience and character necessary to build or preserve lasting wealth. You have a choice to make now, Sarah. You can contact the lawyers and financial managers whose information I have provided and immediately take control of your inheritance. You can exclude your relatives completely and use the foundation's resources for charitable purposes without their interference or manipulation. Or you can attempt to share this wealth with family members who have demonstrated only greed and entitlement, knowing that doing so will likely destroy the charitable work that has given our wealth meaning and purpose. I cannot make this choice for you, but I can tell you that wealth shared with unworthy people rarely creates happiness or strengthens relationships. Money given to people who have not earned it through character and effort usually corrupts them further and creates resentment rather than gratitude. Whatever you decide, remember that this inheritance comes with responsibilities that extend far beyond your personal comfort and security. Thousands of people benefit from the Foundation's work. Dozens of institutions depend on our continued support. The charitable legacy your grandfather and I built represent our most important contribution to the world. Don't let family greed destroy the work we spent our lives creating. But also don't sacrifice your own happiness and relationships for people who have shown themselves incapable of appreciating generosity or understanding responsibility.
Trust your judgment, Sarah. You have already proven your character by completing this treasure hunt without revealing your discoveries to relatives who would have demanded immediate access to assets they haven't earned. That same strength will guide you in the decisions ahead. With all my love and complete confidence in your future, Grandmother Rose. P.S. Call Theodore Morrison at Morrison Legal Associates tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. He has been waiting to hear from you and will begin the inheritance transfer process immediately. Tell him you have found all 4 caches and are ready to assume control of the foundation. He will handle everything else. I sat in Rose's study, surrounded by the sound of estate investigators tearing apart the house in search of assets I'd already discovered and secured, holding legal documents that would make their investigation irrelevant and my relatives' greed pointless. $25 million. A charitable foundation affecting thousands of lives. Legal protection from family interference. And the responsibility to decide whether my grandmother's assessment of my relatives' character was accurate enough to justify excluding them from wealth that could change their lives forever. Outside the study,
I could hear Margaret Chen explaining to Patricia that their preliminary sweep had detected evidence of recent excavation in the garden area. My relatives were about to learn that someone had been conducting their own treasure hunt on the property, which would likely increase their suspicion about my role in hiding assets they believed belonged to the entire family. I had perhaps an hour before their investigation reached the study, and they began examining the bookshelves more closely. 60 minutes to decide whether to immediately contact Theodore Morrison and claim my inheritance, or whether to attempt some compromise with family members who were already threatening me with legal action and estate fraud accusations. The choice Rose had prepared me for was about to become unavoidable. In 1 hour, I would either become one of the wealthiest women in Massachusetts, or I would destroy a charitable legacy to appease relatives whose greed had already poisoned any possibility of genuine family relationships. The final test was beginning, and this time the stakes weren't just about money. They were about the kind of person I wanted to become when I possessed the power that wealth provides. The sound of Margaret Chen's voice calling my relatives to the garden changed everything. "Mrs. Williams, Mr. Hartwell, you need to see what we found outside. There's clear evidence of recent excavation in multiple locations around the property." I heard Patricia's sharp intake of breath, followed by the rapid footsteps of my entire family rushing toward the back door. Through the study window, I watched them gather around Margaret as she pointed to areas where my careful digging had left subtle but detectable traces in the soil. Based on the soil displacement patterns and vegetation disturbance, Margaret explained someone has been conducting systematic searches of this property within the past few days. The excavations appear targeted rather than random, suggesting whoever did this knew exactly where to look. Roger's lawyer voice cut through the afternoon air with accusatory precision. "Sarah, I think you need to join us out here. We have some serious questions about your recent activities on this property." I tucked Rose's legal documents into my jacket pocket and walked outside to face what I knew would be the final confrontation with my family. The investigators had identified 3 of the 4 cache locations, their equipment sophisticated enough to detect ground disturbance I'd thought was invisible. Patricia stood with her arms crossed, her real estate agent composure replaced by barely controlled fury. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, you have been lying to us for days. You've been conducting your own treasure hunt while pretending to know nothing about hidden assets. I want to know what you found and where you've hidden it." The accusation hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. My relatives formed a semicircle around me, their expressions ranging from betrayal to outright hostility. Even quiet Uncle Robert looked angry, his engineer's mind probably calculating how much money I might have discovered without sharing it with the family. I found exactly what grandmother wanted me to find, and what I found explains why she excluded all of you from her real inheritance. Daniel stepped forward with the aggressive posture of someone preparing for confrontation. "What the hell does that mean? What real inheritance? We are grandmother's legal heirs, and you don't have any special claim to assets that belong to this entire family." I pulled Rose's notarized letter from my pocket and read aloud the key passage. "These assets are being transferred exclusively to my granddaughter Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell in recognition of her character, integrity, and demonstrated capacity for responsible asset management. This transfer excludes all other family members not because of lack of affection, but because of their demonstrated patterns of financial irresponsibility, entitlement, and manipulation." The silence that followed was deafening. My relatives stared at me with expressions of shock, disbelief, and growing rage as the implications of Rose's words sank in. "That's impossible," Patricia finally whispered. "Mother couldn't have excluded us from her estate. She died intestate, without a will. Everything gets divided equally among her children and grandchildren according to state law." I continued reading from Rose's letter. Any legal challenges to this inheritance arrangement will result in the immediate dissolution of all charitable commitments and the redirection of all assets to national charitable organizations beyond the reach of my surviving family members. Roger snatched the document from my hands, his lawyer eyes scanning the legal language with increasing urgency. "This is notarized and witnessed. Sarah, how much money are we talking about? What assets did Rose transfer to you?"
Good. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Theodore Morrison, and I've been Rose Hartwell's attorney for the past 8 years. The inheritance arrangement you're threatening to challenge was carefully planned and legally implemented according to Massachusetts state law. Any attempt to contest it will result in the immediate dissolution of the charitable foundation and the redirection of all assets to national organizations beyond your reach. Patricia grabbed my phone, her voice shaking with rage. "Mr. Morrison, this is Patricia Williams, Rose's daughter. What you've done is illegal. You helped an elderly woman exclude her family from her rightful inheritance. We're going to sue you, Sarah, and anyone else involved in this theft." Theodore's response was coldly professional. "Mrs. Williams, I must inform you that everything you've said has been recorded and could constitute evidence of attempted inheritance fraud. Rose Hartwell was legally competent when she made these arrangements, and the documentation is ironclad. I strongly recommend that you consult independent legal counsel before making any further accusations or threats." Roger had been listening with the focused attention of someone whose legal expertise was being challenged by a superior opponent. "Morrison, what exactly are the terms of this inheritance? What prevents us from challenging it as undue influence or elder abuse?" The inheritance was structured as a series of irrevocable trusts executed over a period of 3 years. Rose was psychologically evaluated by independent physicians, interviewed by ethics specialists, and counseled by multiple attorneys to ensure her decisions were made freely and competently. Any legal challenge would need to overcome extensive documentation of her mental capacity and voluntary decision-making. Margaret Chen had been taking notes throughout the confrontation, and now she approached me with professional courtesy. "Ms. Mitchell, it appears that our investigation services are no longer needed. The assets in question have been located and appear to be legally transferred according to proper procedures." My relatives watched in stunned silence as the estate investigators packed their equipment and prepared to leave. Their hopes of discovering hidden assets had been replaced by the devastating reality that those assets had been legally transferred beyond their reach. As Margaret's van pulled away, Patricia made one final desperate attempt to change the situation. "Sarah, be reasonable. $25 million is more money than any one person needs. You could share it with the family and still have more wealth than you could spend in a lifetime." I looked at my aunt, this woman who'd spent the past 3 days treating me like a potential thief, and realized that Rose's assessment of her character had been completely accurate. Even now, facing legal defeat, Patricia was trying to manipulate me into sharing wealth she'd been excluded from because of her own greed and entitlement. "The money isn't mine to share," I said. "It belongs to a charitable foundation that supports hospitals, schools, and community organizations throughout New England. Grandmother didn't accumulate wealth for personal luxury. She used it to improve other people's lives." Daniel made one last aggressive move toward me, apparently hoping physical intimidation might succeed where legal threats had failed. "Sarah, you can't seriously believe you deserve all of Grandmother's money while her actual children get nothing."
I don't deserve it because I'm special. I deserve it because I'm the only person in this family who never asked for it, never expected it, and never tried to manipulate grandmother into giving it to me. Roger was already on his phone, apparently calling other lawyers to explore options for challenging the inheritance. Patricia had retreated to her car with Marcus and Daniel, their voices carrying across the garden as they planned legal strategies and discussed potential litigation costs. Robert and Linda stood by the garden gate, looking defeated and lost. Of all my relatives, Robert seemed most affected by Rose's assessment of his character, perhaps because he recognized the truth in her accusations about his financial irresponsibility and weakness. "Sarah, I want you to know that I don't agree with what Patricia's planning. I think Mother had the right to dispose of her assets however she chose. But I also hope you'll remember that we're still family, regardless of what happens with the money." It was the closest thing to an apology or acceptance I was likely to get from any of them. Robert had always been the most decent of my father's siblings, just weak-willed and easily influenced by others. "Thank you, Uncle Robert. I hope we can maintain a relationship that isn't about money or inheritance, but that choice belongs to all of you as much as it belongs to me." By evening, the house was finally quiet. My relatives had returned to their hotels to plan legal strategies and nurse their wounded pride. The estate sale had been indefinitely postponed while lawyers sorted through the inheritance documentation. Helen Morrison's team had packed up their cataloging equipment no longer needed for an estate sale that would never happen. I sat in Rose's study, surrounded by the books that had hidden her final cash, and called Theodore Morrison to begin the formal process of claiming my inheritance. "Sarah, I want you to understand that the next few months will be difficult. Your family will likely pursue legal challenges despite the futility of their position. They may attempt to manipulate you through guilt, threats, or appeals to family loyalty. Are you prepared for that kind of pressure?" Grandmother prepared me. She knew exactly how they would react, and she gave me the strength to handle it. Good, because protecting $25 million from people who believe they deserve it requires more than legal documentation. It requires character and determination that many people lack when faced with family pressure.
6 months later, I stood in the offices of the Hartwell Foundation, reviewing grant applications for the upcoming fiscal year. My relatives had pursued legal challenges for exactly 60 days before their lawyers informed them that the costs of litigation would exceed any possible recovery. Patricia had stopped speaking to me entirely. Robert sent Christmas cards, but nothing more. Their children had moved on to other sources of expected inheritance. The foundation's work continued and expanded. We provided scholarships for promising students, funded medical research at children's hospitals, and supported historic preservation projects throughout New England. Every month, I signed checks that changed people's lives, continuing the work that had given Rose and William's wealth meaning and purpose. I'd moved to Boston and hired a financial manager, an accountant, and a legal team to help manage the complexity of substantial wealth. But I'd also kept my freelance graphic design work, maintained my modest lifestyle, and used my inheritance to create positive change rather than personal luxury. Rose had been right about the test that wealth represents. Having $25 million provided opportunities to help others, but also constant temptation to indulge myself, to buy influence, to solve problems with money rather than effort. The foundation's work kept me focused on using wealth responsibly, rather than letting it corrupt my values and relationships. Sometimes I walked through Salem's downtown area and saw the historic buildings our foundation had helped restore, the community center we'd funded, the scholarship recipients whose educations we'd supported. Rose's hidden inheritance had been about more than money. It had been about the responsibility to improve the world with the resources we'd been blessed to possess. The estate sale that had started everything never happened. The Victorian house on Elm Street became the foundation's headquarters, its rooms filled with staff members who managed our charitable programs rather than relatives fighting over antique furniture. And in the garden, where I'd first discovered Rose's buried treasure, I planted new roses in her memory,
varieties that would bloom every spring as a reminder that the most valuable inheritances aren't money or property, but the values and character that allow us to use whatever resources we possess in ways that honor the people who loved and trusted us. Rose Hartwell had given me far more than $25 million. She'd given me the opportunity to prove that I was worthy of her trust and the responsibility to ensure that her life's work would continue long after both of us were gone. The inheritance I discovered during that estate sale had changed my life completely, but in ways my greedy relatives would never understand, because they'd never learned that the real treasure isn't the wealth you accumulate, but the wisdom to use it for purposes greater than yourself.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.